My son-in-law thought he could barge into my home with his friends, but he left alone. The family's cozy Lake Tahoe Halloween party had turned into a cold stage. Inside, son-in-law Ben's thumping music drowned out the crackling fire in the fireplace. The ribs David had been preparing all day were replaced by fancy pizza boxes. Worse, Ben had just publicly announced his intention to buy this very house to build a lavish resort, making his father-in-law redundant. David found his daughter, Olivia, standing huddled on the breezy porch. "Levy," David began, his voice soft but laced with pain. "This isn't a business meeting. This is our home. Don't you see what she's doing?" Olivia turned, her eyes averted. "Dad, he's just being a little overzealous. It's his way of showing love by building a better future for us." "A future built on the ashes of the past, Olivia," David's voice sharpened. "He just humiliated Dad in front of all our friends. He called our house a burden. That's not love. That's possession." "You don't understand," Olivia cried, her voice breaking. "You only see his bad side. He wasn't always like this." "Where's his good side, baby?" David yelled, his composure finally breaking. "Where was he when he was tearing this family apart?" I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The pizza arrived not as a delivery, but as an entrance. The young man at the door held 4 sleek black boxes, stacked like architectural plans, from a place called Artisan Hearth. Ben made a great show of it, pulling a $100 bill from a wallet thick enough to stop a door. "Keep the change, my man," he said, his voice booming with a kind of performative generosity that was really about himself. He personally distributed the slices, holding them out on crisp paper napkins. "You have to try the fig and prosciutto," he insisted to David's neighbors, who took them with the polite, slightly confused smiles of people caught between 2 warring hosts. David watched the scene from the kitchen, a stack of clean plates in his hands. His ribs, gleaming under the warm light of the buffet lamp, suddenly looked sad. They were a relic from a different party, a different time. He saw his friend Margaret hesitate, then accept a slice of pizza from Ben, carefully placing it on her plate as far from her untouched serving of ribs as possible. It was a small act, a minor culinary betrayal, but it felt like a stone dropping into the placid water of David's soul, the ripples spreading wider and wider. Later, the party cleaved itself in 2. David's friends, the people who had celebrated Olivia's birthdays in this very room, congregated near the warmth of the fireplace, their conversation quieter now, more subdued. They were trying to pretend they didn't notice the other camp, the one that had taken over the heavy oak dining table. Ben and his partners had their laptops open. One of them had even produced a portable projector, and now a ghostly blueprint of David's own property was shimmering on the far wall. They weren't talking, they were strategizing. Murmurs of zoning variances, water rights, and tear-down potential drifted across the room, alien and sharp. They were dissecting his home like a patient on the operating table, and David felt a surge of violation so profound it was almost physical. He found Olivia on the deck, hugging her arms against the chill coming off the lake. The reflection of the party was a chaotic smear of light on the dark water. "Livy," he began, his voice softer than he intended. "This isn't a business meeting. This is our home." She didn't look at him. "Dad, he just gets carried away. He sees potential in everything. It's what makes him so successful." Her words were practiced, a familiar shield. "You don't see him when it's just us. He's different. This morning he brought me coffee in bed, just the way I like it. He remembered the cinnamon, all the after-dew." She was pleading with him, not to understand Ben, but to allow her to continue her own fragile illusion. She was clinging to the cinnamon, a tiny speck of sweetness in the face of this overwhelming bitterness. David saw it then. She wasn't just making excuses. She was afraid. Afraid of the ambition she had tethered herself to. The final act began when the music died down. Ben stood in the center of the room and clinked the spoon against his craft beer bottle. It was a sound both festive and commanding. "Everyone, can I have your attention for a moment?" he asked, beaming as if he were about to announce a winning lottery number. The room fell silent. "I want to thank my incredible father-in-law, David, for hosting us in this absolutely magnificent setting. He gestured around the room, at the hand-hewn beams and the stone fireplace. This house has history, it has soul. It's a testament to a generation that built things to last. They're all this back this one. David felt a flicker of hope. Was this an apology? A moment of grace? But, Ben continued, and the word hung in the air, sharp and cold. As we all know, the future waits for no one. Legacy isn't about preserving the past. It's about leveraging it for a bigger, brighter future. He clicked a button on a small remote, and the blueprint on the wall was replaced by a gleaming, computer-generated image. A series of glass and steel cubes perched on the hillside where David's home now stood. It looked like a futuristic clinic. My partners and I have been working on a project, Ben announced, his voice slick with the thrill of the reveal. A vision. We want to buy this property and transform it into the Tahoe Pinnacle, an exclusive members-only wellness and longevity retreat. We're talking cryotherapy, biohacking, Michelin-star chefs. He finally turned to David, his smile so wide it looked painful. We are, of course, prepared to make you an offer that would be life-changing. A way to take this burden off your hands, David. To set you up for life. A real win-win. He set a glossy brochure down on the coffee table. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. Of all the warmth and air being sucked out of the room, Ben stood there, triumphant, waiting for the applause that would surely come. Olivia was chalk white, her eyes a horror-stricken pendulum swinging between her husband's confident, predatory grin and her father's utterly devastated face. David didn't look at the brochure. He didn't look at Ben. He looked only at his daughter, and his quiet gaze held the only question that mattered now, the question that would define everything that came after. Whose side are you on? For a long moment after Ben's presentation, no one moved. The glossy brochure for the Tahoe Pinnacle lay on the coffee table, an obscene tombstone marking the death of the evening. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire, a sound that had been a comfort all night but now felt like a countdown. David didn't look at the brochure. He didn't look at Ben. He looked only at his daughter, and his quiet gaze held the only question that mattered now, the question that would define everything that came after. Whose side are you on? Olivia stood frozen, a statue of indecision. Her face was a canvas of shock and dawning horror. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was this hesitation, this flicker of paralysis, that Ben took for victory. He had laid his cards on the table, and he believed he held the winning hand. David slowly, deliberately rose from his armchair. He didn't engage with Ben's monstrous proposition. He simply began to collect empty glasses, his movements methodical and calm. He was a host tidying up at the end of a long night. To Ben, this was submission, the final white flag. He saw David's quiet dignity as the weary resignation of a defeated old man. This miscalculation was the beginning of his end. Intoxicated by his own perceived power, Ben followed David toward the kitchen. "Look, David," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, man-to-man tone that was somehow more insulting than his public booming. "I get it. This is emotional. But let's be realistic. This place is a lot for one person to handle. Think of it as unlocking your equity. You could travel, see the world. You've earned it." David placed a glass in the sink and turned on the tap. The sound of running water, a soft, steady rhythm against Ben's monologue. He didn't answer. He just washed the glass. Frustrated by the silence, Ben's condescension sharpened into a crueler edge. He walked back into the living room, where his partners were now awkwardly shuffling their feet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. David's friends watched from the fireplace, their faces grim. Ben clapped his hands together, a sharp, jarring sound. "Hey, guys," he announced, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "I have an idea. The real master of this house looks a little tired." He gestured with his hat toward David, who was now drying the glass with a linen towel. "Why don't we help him go to bed early?" It was a declaration of war disguised as a joke. Two of his partners, younger men with the broad shoulders and easy swagger of those who have always followed a leader, stepped forward with him. They approached David, who had now turned to face them. the towel still in his hand. The room held its breath. "Come on, champ," Ben said, reaching out to place a hand on David's arm. "You've had a big night. Let's get you tucked in." The moment Ben's fingers touched the sleeve of David's sweater, something shifted. David didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply looked down at the hand on his arm and then up at Ben's face. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was something far colder, far more absolute. It was the calm, dispassionate gaze of a surgeon who has identified the cancer and knows with certainty that it must be cut out. "Take your hand off me," David said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the room with the force of a guillotine. Ben, surprised by the resistance, laughed, a short, nervous bark. "Hey, easy now." "I said," David repeated, his voice dropping even lower, yet gaining an impossible weight. "Take it off." Now, Ben's smile faltered. He let go. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood in the center of his home, a place that had been violated and mocked all evening, and reclaimed it with 3 words. "Get out," he said to Ben. Ben stared, dumbfounded. "What did you say?" "You heard me," David said, his eyes now flicking to Ben's partners, then to every guest in the room. His authority was effortless and total. "The party's over. Get out of my house." All eyes swung to Olivia. This was her moment, the crossroads she had been avoiding all night. Ben turned to her, expecting his shield, his apologist. "Olivia, tell your father." "No," Olivia said. The word was a whisper, but it resonated like a scream in the silent room. She stepped forward, placing herself between her father and her husband. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Ben as if seeing him for the first time. The charm, the ambition, the success it had all burned away, leaving only the ugly, grasping bully beneath. He said, "Get out, Ben," she said, her voice stronger now. "So get out." The spell was broken. Humiliation washed over Ben's face, a tide of mottled red. He looked around for support, but his friends were already backing away, suddenly fascinated by their shoes. David's neighbors were watching with undisguised contempt. He had misplayed his hand so badly, he had overturned the entire table. Without another word, Ben turned and walked toward the door. His partner scrambled after him like pilot fish deserting a shark. The front door opened, letting in a blast of cold mountain air, and then slammed shut. The sound echoed through the house. For a long time, nobody spoke. The drone of an engine starting, the crunch of tires on gravel, and then silence. David stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, looking into the flames. Olivia was a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. The remaining guests, David's true friends, began to quietly gather their coats, understanding that the family needed to be alone. The perfect party was over, leaving behind the wreckage of a life and the terrifying, uncertain quiet of what came next. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating as smoke. "Why don't we help him go to bed early?" Ben's pronouncement was meant to be a joke, the punchline to an evening-long performance of dominance. But no one laughed. A profound and sudden chill swept through the room, colder than the October air outside. David's neighbors, who had been trying to maintain a polite distance from the unfolding drama, now stood rigid, their drinks forgotten in their hands. They were no longer guests at a party. They were witnesses. Ben, blinded by his own momentum, mistook the stunned silence for rapt attention. He was a performer who had lost his audience but didn't know it yet. He gestured to 2 of his partners' younger, brawnier versions of himself, men who wore their ambition like an expensive suit. "Come on, guys," he said, his voice laced with a cruel joviality. "Let's escort the captain to his quarters." The 2 men moved. It wasn't a rush, but a slow, deliberate advance that was far more menacing. They flanked Ben as they approached the leather armchair where David sat, a small, quiet island in a stormy sea. They didn't touch him. They didn't have to. They simply stood over him, 3 large bodies casting a collective shadow, boxing him in. They invaded his space with the casual entitlement of conquerors, their smiles no longer playful, but contemptuous masks of mockery. David didn't shrink back. He didn't rise to meet them. He simply sat there, his hands resting on the worn arms of the chair, his gaze steady. His stillness was an act of profound defiance, a silent refusal to participate in his own humiliation. The pressure in the room became unbearable. Ben leaned down, his face close to David's, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for him, but in the dead silence, it carried. Time for bed, Dad. This party is for adults now. That was the breaking point. Ben, what are you doing? The voice was Mrs. Miller's, sharp with a distress that sliced through the tension. Her husband, a gentleman who had known David for 30 years, took a protective step forward. The public nature of the threat was now undeniable. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was a public shaming, a violation of every unspoken rule of decency. But before Mr. Miller could say another word, a flash of movement erupted from near the deck doors. It was Olivia. For hours, she had been a ghost at her own party, caught in the undertow of her husband's personality. But seeing those three men looming over her father, seeing the quiet, unyielding dignity in his face, was like a bucket of ice water to the soul. The carefully constructed cocoon of denial she had wrapped around herself for years tore apart. Ben, stop it, she cried, her voice raw. She launched herself forward, physically planting her body between her husband and her father's chair, a small but immovable barrier. What the hell are you doing? Ben looked at her, his expression not of surprise or shame, but of sheer annoyance, as if she were a misbehaving child interrupting an important meeting. He was completely unfazed. I'm doing what needs to be done, he said, his voice cold and flat, all pretense of humor gone. He wasn't just speaking to her. He was making a declaration to the entire room. This place needs a real owner, Olivia, not some old man who sits around judging everyone. He's ruining the fun. Not only was he trying to physically remove David, but he was also trying to strip him of his very identity within the walls of his own home. He was a relic, an obstacle, a killjoy. In that moment, standing as a shield before her father, Olivia felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The constant, low-grade fear she felt around Ben, the fear of his moods, of his ambition, of disappointing him, evaporated. It was replaced by a clean, searing, righteous anger. She saw him not as the charismatic, successful man she had fallen in love with, but as a hollow thing, a bully who mistook kindness for weakness and history for a teardown. She looked from her husband's furious face to her father's calm one. The choice had been there all along, hiding in plain sight behind a wall of excuses and compromises. The standoff was absolute. The three men, the defiant daughter, and the silent father at the center of it all. Ben stared at his wife, this stranger who had suddenly appeared in her place, and he saw his victory, his perfect acquisition, slipping through his fingers. He had pushed too far. He had made a fatal miscalculation, but backing down was not in his nature. He looked at Olivia, then at the old man in the chair, and realized he had to force the endgame. He would burn the whole house down before he walked away with nothing. He would issue an ultimatum. The space Olivia carved out between her husband and her father was a no man's land, charged with the wreckage of the evening. Ben stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. This was not in his script. She was supposed to be the buffer, the diplomat, the one who smoothed his sharp edges. She was not supposed to be the opposition. Olivia, you're being hysterical, he snapped, his voice a low, controlled hiss. This doesn't concern you. It doesn't concern me? Her laugh was a brittle, broken sound. My father? In his own home? Ben, look at yourself. Look at what you're doing. He glanced around the room, and for the first time, he seemed to register the gallery of horrified faces. He saw the Millers, clutching each other's arms. He saw his own partners, now looking profoundly uncomfortable, their alpha male bravado dissolving into a kind of shifty embarrassment. He saw a jury, and they had already reached a verdict. In that split second, Ben realized he could not win with logic or charm. He was losing control of the narrative. And so, like a cornered animal, he chose not to retreat but to lunge for the throat. He took a deliberate step back from Olivia, creating a stark physical distance between them. He crossed his arms over his chest, a gesture of finality, of power reasserted. The air in the room seemed to crystallize, each molecule vibrating with a terrible, silent tension. Everyone stopped breathing. "Fine, Olivia," he said. His voice was cold, devoid of all emotion, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. "If you want to protect him, then choose." He let the words hang there, a poisoned dart in the heart of the silence. Olivia flinched as if struck. Ben's eyes were like chips of stone. "Choose," he repeated, his voice dropping, each word a hammer blow. "Him or me. You can't have both." He paused, letting the full weight of his cruelty sink in. He was a master of this kind of warfare. "Do you want a future, a life like the one we're building, or do you want to be stuck here, in the past, with this old man?" He gestured dismissively toward David, who remained perfectly still in his armchair, a forgotten king on a chessboard that had just been violently overturned. Ben leaned forward slightly, his final word an indictment, a command, a closing of all doors. "Choose." The word echoed in the dead air. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, turning his own monstrous behavior into a referendum on his wife's loyalty. He had gambled everything on her dependency, on the beautiful life he had built for her, on the subtle fear he had cultivated in her for years. He was 100% certain of his victory, and he wanted everyone here to witness it. He wanted them to see her choose him, to see her abandon her own father, cementing Ben's place as the new, undisputed patriarch. All eyes, which had been on Ben, now swiveled to Olivia. She stood alone in the center of the room, a woman caught between two lives. On one side was Ben, the embodiment of her future, gleaming, ambitious, and terrifyingly conditional. On the other was her father, the anchor to her past, quiet, steadfast, and now utterly vulnerable. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that seemed to press down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. You could almost see the war raging behind her eyes, the years of making excuses, of clinging to the good moments, of telling herself that his ambition was a virtue, not a cancer. David didn't look at Ben. He hadn't looked at him once during the entire exchange. His eyes were only on his daughter. There was no pleading in his gaze, no anger, no hint of pressure. He was not a man begging to be saved. He was a father, watching his child face the most important decision of her life, and his silence was the ultimate act of faith. It was a silence that said, "Whoever you choose to be in this moment, I will love you. You are your own person. You decide." In his quiet, unwavering eyes, Olivia saw everything she had been missing. She didn't see weakness or obsolescence, the things Ben had tried to make her see all night. She saw profound and unconditional love. She saw a strength that didn't need to announce itself, a dignity that couldn't be bought or sold or leveraged for a real estate deal. She saw home. The smug, confident smile on Ben's face began to tighten at the edges. The silence was stretching on for too long. The room was waiting. David was waiting. Ben was waiting. Olivia took a single, deep breath. The first full breath she had taken all night. It was a breath of a woman who was no longer drowning. She was about to give the answer that would change everyone's lives. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect vacuum waiting to be filled. Ben's smug smile was cemented on his face, the look of a man who had just checkmated an opponent in 3 moves. He was waiting for Olivia's inevitable, tearful capitulation. She took a deep breath, and then she moved. It was not a large movement. It was a single step, but in the charged atmosphere of the living room, it was a seismic event. She stepped away from the invisible line that had tethered her to Ben and planted herself directly in front of her father's armchair. It was not a retreat. It was an alignment. She had chosen her ground. She had become a shield. Ben's smile began to flicker, the first crack in his perfect facade. "Olivia?" he prompted, a faint note of irritation in his voice. She looked straight into his eyes. Her own were shockingly clear, free of the conflict that had clouded them all evening. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was a bell, ringing with a clarity that startled everyone, most of all her husband. "I choose my father," she said. The 3 words landed in the room with the finality of a judge's gavel. Ben's face went slack, a mask of pure disbelief. He looked as if she had just started speaking in a foreign language. Olivia didn't stop. She had found her voice, and she would be heard. You kept talking about the master of this house, she continued, her tone steady and deliberate. You asked who the real owner was. It's him. She gestured behind her to David. This party, it was for him, for his friends, his neighbors, in his home. She took another small step toward Ben, and for the first time, he recoiled. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. You were a guest here, Ben, she said, her voice dropping, but gaining an edge of steel. And you are no longer welcome. She pointed a single steady finger toward the heavy oak front door. Now, get out. The fall was swift and brutal. The smugness on Ben's face collapsed, replaced by a flash of rage, which was then washed away by a tide of utter humiliation. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, a friendly glance, anything. He found nothing. His partners, the men who had stood with him moments before, were now intensely studying the pattern on the Persian rug. The Millers and the other neighbors watched him with a cold, quiet judgment. He had performed for them all evening, and this was his final, disastrous act. He was utterly, completely alone. He looked back at Olivia one last time, a flicker of pathetic desperation in his eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Without another word, he turned. His movements were stiff, robotic. He walked the long, silent path to the door, each footstep a thunderclap in the quiet room. His partners, after a moment of awkward hesitation, scurried after him, not as a posse, but as rats deserting a sinking ship. The door opened, flooding the room with the cold night air, and then slammed shut, the sound a definitive, echoing full stop. For a moment, no one moved. The house, which had felt so invaded and tense, seemed to exhale a long collective sigh. The lingering tension dissolved, replaced by a fragile, sacred peace. Then, the adrenaline that had fueled Olivia's courage receded, and a tremor ran through her. Her legs suddenly felt weak, as if they might not hold her. Before she could falter, David was on his feet. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his daughter. Olivia buried her face in his shoulder and finally let out the sob she had been holding back for years. It was a sound not of sadness, but of profound, aching release. David held her, his own eyes burning with tears, his heart swelling with a pride so immense it was almost painful. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In that silent, powerful embrace, everything was understood. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the presence of his late wife so strongly it was as if she were standing right there with them, her hand on their daughter's back. He knew, with absolute certainty, that she would be so proud. The slam of the front door was a sonic boom that broke the spell, leaving behind a ringing, profound silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The party was over, but the guests remained, statues in a tableau of shock and relief. David's arm was still around his daughter, a silent anchor in the sudden, vast emptiness left by Ben's departure. Then, a furtive movement broke the stillness. It was Ben's friends. The men who had arrived like a conquering army now seemed to shrink into themselves. Their bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a slick residue of embarrassment. They avoided everyone's eyes, especially Olivia's. There were no grand pronouncements now, no booming laughs. They moved with a stealthy, hurried purpose, silently gathering their belongings. One of them unplugged the giant Bluetooth speaker, its sudden silence making the room feel even bigger. Another began collecting the unopened bottles from their cases of expensive craft beer. It was a retreat, not a departure. One of the younger men, the one who had flanked Ben in front of David's chair, walked past David on his way out. He couldn't quite meet his eyes, focusing instead on a point somewhere over David's shoulder. "Sorry about this, sir," he mumbled, the words almost inaudible. The apology was thin and self-serving, offered not for their collective cruelty, but for the social awkwardness they now felt. They didn't leave through the front door, the one that had just been so dramatically slammed. They found a side door off the kitchen, slipping out into the night like thieves. Their cowardly exit was a final damning judgment on the Hollow Kingdom Ben had tried to build. As the sound of their cars faded down the long driveway, another kind of movement began. It was quiet, gentle. Mrs. Miller, her face etched with a deep and motherly concern, approached Olivia with a glass of water. She didn't say a word, just pressed the cool glass into Olivia's trembling hands. Mr. Jones came and stood beside David, placing a firm, warm hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture that said everything. I saw. I'm with you. You are not alone. One by one, David's friends, the people who were the true heart of this house, offered their quietest support. They were not celebrating a victory. They were bearing witness to a trauma. They gave Olivia a soft smile, a brief squeeze of the arm. They understood that the night had exacted a terrible price. They began to collect their coats, offering hushed, gentle goodbyes at the door, their presence a comforting blanket before they finally receded, leaving the family to its new, fractured peace. As the last car pulled away, Olivia looked around the room, at the old friends who had watched her grow up, who had stayed not out of obligation, but out of love. A whispered thank you was all she could manage. In that moment, the value of a genuine, time-tested community stood in stark contrast to the superficial loyalty that had just fled into the darkness. And then, they were alone. David and Olivia sat in the living room, the silence now theirs alone. The wreckage of the party was a landscape of the evening's battle. The glossy Tahoe Pinnacle brochure lay on the coffee table, an artifact from a hostile civilization. The black boxes from Artisan Hearth sat on the counter, the gourmet pizza now cold and congealed. Ben's speaker stood near the fireplace, a silent, black monolith. Each object was a symbol of the rupture, a piece of a life that no longer existed. David didn't say, I told you so. He didn't offer advice. He simply sat with his daughter in the quiet aftermath, creating a safe harbor for her to navigate the storm inside her. He felt a deep, aching sadness, not for himself, but for her. He knew that true protection wasn't about shielding his daughter from every pain, but about trusting he'd raised her with the strength to face painful choices on her own. And she had. Minutes stretched by. The fire crackled. The old house seemed to wrap its arms around them. Finally, Olivia turned to him, her face pale in the firelight, her eyes holding the terrifying, wide-open question of the future. Her voice, when she spoke, was a fragile whisper. Now, what do I do, Dad? I bet 99% of you will hear this. Sigh and scroll past without clicking. Like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The morning sun cast long, gentle fingers of light across the living room floor, illuminating the aftermath. The house was preternaturally quiet, holding its breath after the fever of the previous night. David found Olivia on the sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, not sleeping but staring with hollow eyes at the placid, indifferent surface of the lake. He didn't speak, simply went about the familiar ritual of making coffee, the rich, comforting aroma, a small act of normalcy in a world that had been tilted off its axis. Wordlessly, they began to clean. It was a symbolic, necessary task. Olivia picked up one of the empty craft beer bottles Ben's friends had brought. Its aggressive, artisanal label, a stark reminder of the invasion. She dropped it into the recycling bin with a definitive clink. David gathered the sleek black pizza boxes from Artisan Hearth and broke them down, his movements methodical and calm. Together, they were erasing the physical evidence of Ben's presence, dismantling the stage on which their lives had fractured. They were not just cleaning a room, they were performing a quiet exorcism. They had just finished, the space restored to its familiar, peaceful state, when Olivia's phone, lying screen down on the coffee table like an unexploded ordnance, began to buzz. The single, sharp vibration sliced through the fragile silence. Olivia flinched as if she'd been struck. It buzzed again, a relentless, electronic summons from a world she desperately wanted to leave behind. She stared at it, her body tensing, her breath catching in her throat. With a deep, shuddering sigh, she picked it up. David watched her face, seeing the war play out in real time. The screen lit up, and the first message appeared. A flicker of something pained and familiar crossed her features, not hope, but the ghost of it. Liv, I'm so sorry. I went too far. I was an idiot. I love you. Please, just call me. For a heartbeat, she wavered. It was the old script, the one she knew by heart. The explosion, followed by the remorse. But before she could even process it, the phone buzzed again. Her expression tightened. Are you really going to throw away everything we've built? Our entire life? For your father? The manipulation, once so effective, now felt clumsy and transparent. The tiny flicker of old loyalty died. The phone buzzed a third time, more insistently. Her jaw clenched. Fine, ignore me, if that's what you want. But don't think for a second you're taking anything from me. You'll walk away with nothing. The final mask was off. The last message came a second later, a digital kill shot. David saw the color drain completely from his daughter's face, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. I will make you and your old man regret this. I will take everything. You will be penniless and alone. I promise you that. The threats meant to shatter her did the opposite. They were a final clarifying gift. They cauterized the wound, burning away any last vestige of doubt or sentimentality. The man she had married was not just arrogant, he was cruel. David saw the terror warring with a new, cold resolve in her eyes. He moved from the kitchen and sat beside her on the sofa, his presence a calm, solid anchor in her storm. His words have no power here, honey, he said, his voice gentle but firm. This isn't a fight you have to have with him over the phone. This is something else now. This is a legal matter. He paused, looking at her with absolute certainty. We need to talk to a professional. I have a friend, an attorney in town. She's the best. 3 hours later, they stepped out of the raw, emotional landscape of the lake house and into the hushed, ordered world of Henderson and Associates. The office was a fortress of quiet competence. The air smelled of leather, old paper, and a faint hint of lemon polish. The walls were lined with books bound in dark leather, silent soldiers standing at attention. Across a vast, polished mahogany desk sat Catherine Henderson. She was a woman in her late 50s with a sweep of silver in her dark hair and eyes that were both sharply intelligent and deeply compassionate. She exuded an aura of unshakable calm. Olivia told her story, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as she laid out the facts, the narrative of 1,000 small cuts that had led to the final, gaping wound of the previous night. She ended by showing Mrs. Henderson the string of messages on her phone. Catherine Henderson listened with an absolute, unwavering focus. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. She simply absorbed the facts, her expression a mask of professional empathy. When Olivia finished, she leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. Olivia, she began, her voice calm and reassuring. What you experienced last night and what you are experiencing on this phone is the predictable behavior of a classic narcissist whose control has been challenged. The escalation from pleading to threats is textbook. It is a desperate, pathetic attempt to make you feel powerless. But I assure you, you are not. She began to outline the first steps, the immediate filing for divorce, a temporary restraining order based on the explicit written threats, a petition for a full forensic accounting of their shared and separate assets. With each crisp, definitive action she named, Olivia felt the suffocating fog of fear and confusion begin to lift. This was a plan. This was a strategy. This was a language of power she could finally access. She sat up straighter, feeling not like a victim, but like a client. He's gonna fight, Mrs. Henderson said, her gaze steady and direct. And he's gonna fight dirty, just as he's threatened. His primary weapon will be to make you feel small and financially terrified. She paused, a flicker of something new in her eyes, a glint of a hidden advantage. She looked from Olivia to David, who had remained silent and supportive throughout the meeting. He's threatening to take everything, the lawyer continued, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. But there's one thing he doesn't know, one thing that will change the entire landscape of this battle. She let the words hang in the quiet, professional air. It's about a wedding gift your father prepared for you. A gift that, thank God, he never gave to you both. Olivia stared at the lawyer, her mind struggling to catch up. A gift? She asked, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. What gift? We got a toaster oven from him. A very nice one. But David offered a small, sad smile. He reached down to the leather briefcase at his feet and retrieved a thick, unassuming file bound in dark blue cardstock. He slid it across the polished mahogany desk to Mrs. Henderson. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. Before you and Ben got married, David began, his voice quiet and measured, addressed only to Olivia. I saw signs, cracks, you might call them. His ambition was impressive, but it was hollow. It wasn't about building something. It was about winning. I hoped with all my heart that I was wrong, that your love would temper him, that my fears were just an overprotective father's foolishness. He paused, the confession heavy in the quiet office. But hope isn't a strategy, Livy. My job as your father didn't end when I walked you down the aisle. I had to be prepared. So I set up a trust fund, solely in your name. It was meant to be an inheritance, a way to ensure that you would always, no matter what happened in your life, be financially secure and independent. Olivia was speechless. She looked from her father's earnest, loving face to the file now in Mrs. Henderson's hands. And here, Mrs. Henderson said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the closed file, is where your father's foresight becomes our checkmate. She opened the file, her movements precise. She scanned the page, then looked up at Olivia, her professional calm now tinged with a distinct gleam of admiration. This is the Olivia Sterling Family Trust. The assets are substantial, a significant portion of your father's estate, including diversified investments and properties. It was designed to provide you with a comfortable income for life and eventually pass to your children. She paused, letting the weight of that sink in. But it's not a simple trust. Your father had my predecessor draft a rather unique provision into his bylaws. It's called the Family Dignity Clause. Mrs. Henderson put on a pair of reading glasses and read directly from the document. Her voice was clear and cold as ice. This clause stipulates that should the legal spouse of the primary beneficiary, that's you, Olivia, commit any act, publicly or privately, which is found to willfully and seriously damage the personal honor, reputation, or dignity of the trust founder, that's your father, then the beneficiary shall have the immediate and absolute right to permanently exclude said spouse from any and all current or future benefits, considerations, or claims related to the trust's assets, direct or indirect. She took off her glasses and looked at Olivia, a small, sharp smile playing on her lips. The night of the party, Ben didn't just insult your father. He publicly humiliated him. He attempted to physically intimidate him. He announced his intention to seize his home, and he did it all in front of more than a dozen credible, upstanding witnesses who are all longtime friends of your father. The pieces clicked into place in Olivia's mind, a stunning, brilliant mechanism she never knew existed. The full weight of what her father had done, the quiet foresight, the fierce, hidden protection hit her with the force of a physical blow. Essentially, Mrs. Henderson concluded, her voice crisp. Ben's final desperate power play was to threaten to leave you penniless. The irony is, with his actions that night, he not only kicked himself out of your father's house, he legally and irrevocably disinherited himself from a family fortune he never even knew was on the table. Olivia couldn't speak. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of overwhelming, profound gratitude. She looked at her father, this quiet, unassuming man who restored old boats and made barbecued ribs. She had spent years seeing his gentle nature as something to be protected, something from a bygone era. She realized now that his gentleness was not a weakness. It was the calm surface of an ocean of strength, wisdom, and ferocious love. He hadn't just been waiting for Ben to self-destruct. He had built the very ground on which Ben would do it. David felt a pang of deep relief, an unburdening of a weight he had carried for years. The contingency plan, the one he prayed every day he would never have to use, had just become the lifeline his daughter so desperately needed. So, Olivia finally whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek and looking at Mrs. Henderson, a new fire in her eyes. What happens now? The first move in the new war was made not with a shout, but with a quiet, professional click of a sent email. Mrs. Henderson, with David and Olivia sitting in her office, formally notified Ben's legal counsel of the existence of the Olivia Sterling Family Trust and, specifically, the Family Dignity Clause. She attached a list of the dozen-plus witnesses to the events of the Halloween party. The reaction was immediate. Mrs. Henderson's phone rang less than an hour later. She put it on speakerphone, a gesture of confidence. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Alan Abram, Ben's lawyer, who possessed the kind of booming, condescending tone that came from years of steamrolling opponents. "Catherine, what is this nonsense?" Abram began with a chuckle. "A family dignity clause? That's adorable. It wouldn't survive a single motion in court. Read the codicil on page 4. Alan, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. The one regarding the independent arbiter and the non-contestability of the founder's definition of dignity. There was a rustling of papers on the other end of the line, followed by a very, very long silence. The bluff had been called, and Ben's lawyer had just realized he was holding a losing hand. The silence was broken only by a quiet, "I'll have to call you back." But Ben was not a man who waited for his lawyer. When cornered, his instinct was not to strategize. It was to attack. Minutes later, Olivia's phone rang. It was him. Her hand trembled as she answered, putting him on speaker for her father and lawyer to hear. "You think you're so clever," Ben's voice hissed, stripped of all its former charm. It was the raw, snarling sound of a cornered predator. "You think you won?" Suddenly, a notification popped up on her screen. Ben had sent her a link. It was to an online article from a local medical journal published years ago, with a picture of a younger David, smiling, accepting an award for his service to the community. The headline read, "Dr. David Sterling, a pillar of integrity." "That's a nice article," Ben sneered through the phone. "A whole life's work building that reputation, a real pillar of the community. It will be a shame if someone told the press that the good doctor has a drinking problem, that maybe he's not as sharp as he used to be, that maybe, just maybe, a medical mistake got swept under the rug a few years back. The threat was vile, a nuclear option designed to scorch the earth." Olivia felt a wave of nausea. This was a man she had loved, a man she had shared a bed with. He was threatening to destroy her father's legacy with lies. "Ben, don't. I will ruin him, Olivia," he spat. "His name will be mud in this town. Your inheritance won't mean a thing when his reputation is in ashes. Now, do you still want to fight me?" Olivia looked at her father, her eyes wide with terror. But David was the calmest person in the room. He looked at the phone with a kind of weary sadness, as if watching the predictable, final act of a tragedy. "I knew he would do this," he said quietly, his voice full of a sorrowful certainty. He looked at Mrs. Henderson. "Catherine," he said, "please send Mr. Abram's lawyer the second file, the one labeled due diligence." Mrs. Henderson nodded, a grim understanding on her face. She typed a few quick words on her computer, attached the file, and clicked send. "What is that?" Olivia whispered. "It's the reason Ben needed my money so desperately," David said. "Before you were married, I was concerned about some of his financial habits. His need to always have the newest, the best. It seemed excessive, even for a successful man. So I did what any cautious father would do. I hired a discreet private investigator, a forensic accountant, just to make sure the man my daughter was marrying was who he said he was." Mrs. Henderson turned her screen for Olivia to see. It was a digital folder containing scanned bank statements, encrypted transaction logs from offshore gambling sites, and sworn affidavits. "Ben doesn't have a spending problem, Olivia," the lawyer said gently. "He has a gambling addiction, a severe one. Online poker, high stakes, sports betting. He's lost hundreds of thousands. More than that, to cover his losses, he's been embezzling from his own company, taking out loans against company assets to pay off his debt. The truth was a cold, dark abyss that opened up at Olivia's feet. Ben's ambition, his relentless drive, his obsession with the Tahoe property, it wasn't about building a future. It was about finding a lifeline. He wasn't just trying to conquer David's home. He was trying to liquidate it to save himself from ruin. The documents we just sent prove wire fraud and embezzlement, Mrs. Henderson stated. His threats to your father's reputation are slander. Our evidence, however, is grounds for a federal criminal investigation. The checkmate was total. David's last card wasn't a tactic. It was a truth bomb. Olivia stared into space, the last vestiges of her love story turning to ash. She had not been married to a charismatic, ambitious man. She had been married to a desperate stranger, a hollow man on the edge of a cliff, willing to pull everyone down with him. And the profound sadness she had felt was finally, blessedly, replaced by the clean, cold relief of a narrow escape. The phone rang again. It was Ben's lawyer. His voice was no longer booming. It was a faint, defeated whisper. "He'll sign whatever you want," Alan Abrams said. "Just tell us what you want. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking, like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you and where are you listening?" Spring arrived not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, deliberate thaw. For 6 months, the seasons had turned, diligently working to erase the harsh memory of that Halloween night. The snow line on the granite peaks, ringing Lake Tahoe, retreated day by day, and the meltwater, pure and impossibly cold, fed the lake, turning its color from a wintry steel blue to a vibrant, living sapphire. The air, once thick with the tension of unspoken wars, was now crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine sap, damp earth, and the promise of new growth. The house, which had served as a battlefield, had reclaimed its original purpose. It was a sanctuary again, its large windows filled not with ghostly projections of a hostile future, but with the simple, breathtaking beauty of the present. Down at the private dock, where the water lapped gently against the weathered pylons, David and Olivia worked in a comfortable, practiced silence. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs, a benevolent presence. They were applying the final coats of varnish to the Serenity, the classic wooden runabout that had been David's decade-long meditation in wood and brass. Its restoration was nearly complete. The process of bringing the boat back to life had become a quiet metaphor for Olivia's own healing. In the months following Ben's chaotic departure, there had been a flurry of sterile emails, tense phone calls between lawyers, and the grim, methodical work of disentangling a shared life. Every signature on a legal document felt like a tiny act of liberation, but it also left a void. The silence Ben left behind was, at first, a terrifying vacuum, a space she had once filled with anticipating his moods and managing his ambitions. But slowly, painstakingly, she had begun to fill that silence with herself. Now, dipping a fine bristled brush into the can of glistening marine varnish, her hand was perfectly steady. She drew a slow, even stroke along the gleaming mahogany transom, watching the wood drink in the protective amber liquid. The repetitive motion was soothing, a physical manifestation of the order she was restoring to her own soul. Stripping away the old, blistered layers of paint months ago had felt like an exorcism. Sanding down the imperfections in the wood had been an act of forgiving herself for the years she had ignored them. And now, this final, protective coat felt like a promise of resilience against future storms. "You have a natural touch for this," David said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that blended with the sound of the water. A steady hand. Olivia smiled, a genuine, easy smile that had become more frequent this past few weeks. "It's calming. It makes you focus on the one thing right in front of you." She paused, looking at the rich grain of the wood under her brush. "I signed up for that advanced graphic design course, the one I told you about. It starts next week." "I knew you would," he said, his own smile filled with a quiet, profound pride. He stopped his work, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "You know, when you were about 7, you spent an entire summer drawing the different kinds of pine cones you found in the woods. You had a little sketchbook, and you labeled each one. Your mother framed one of the pages. It's still in the attic somewhere. Other eases. Olivia's hand stilled. The memory was faint, but the feeling it evoked was strong, a sense of pure, uncomplicated joy in the act of creation. It was a part of herself she had packed away, labeling it as frivolous, impractical. Ben had always referred to her artistic talent as a cute hobby, something to occupy her time while he was busy with the real work of building an empire. Now, she understood that her quiet passion was more real and enduring than his entire hollow kingdom. He never understood it, she said softly, more to herself than to her father. Why I'd want to spend hours just looking at things, trying to get the light right. It's not for him to understand, David said gently. It's yours. They lapsed back into a comfortable silence. The only sounds, the rhythmic lapping of the lake and the soft whisper of their brushes. The final, devastating revelations about Ben, his gambling, the embezzlement, the sheer depth of his desperation had been a painful but necessary surgery. It had excised the last lingering vestiges of what if. There was no love story to mourn, only the tragic fiction of a man she had never truly known. Her grief was not for the loss of him, but for the years she had lost of herself. Finally, David set his own brush down, stepping back to admire their handiwork. The serenity glowed in the afternoon light, its polished chrome fittings gleaming, its mahogany hull looking as deep and rich as a pool of dark honey. It was more than a boat. It was a testament. It was proof that what is broken can be mended, that what is old can be made beautiful again, and that true passion, pursued with patience and love, endures. Well, he said, his voice thick with satisfaction, I think she's ready. He looked at Olivia, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The question is, where should we take her for her maiden voyage? Olivia put her brush down and straightened up, a pleasant ache in her back. She looked past the boat, her gaze traveling across the impossibly blue water toward the far shore and the majestic, snow-capped peaks beyond. The world felt vast again, not in a terrifying way, but in a way that was ripe with promise. The horizon was no longer a boundary, but an invitation. She turned to her father, her face illuminated by the warm, forgiving light of the spring Sunday. A real smile, the kind that reached deep into her clear eyes, spread across her face. Anywhere, Dad, she said, her voice soft but sure, filled with a hope that felt as real and solid as the boat beneath their feet. Anywhere at all, as long as we go together. David didn't answer. He simply put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and drew her close. He felt the solidness of her, the resilience, and in that moment, he felt his wife's presence as clearly as if she were standing on the dock beside them. Her hand on Olivia's other shoulder, a warmth in the spring Sunday. He had kept his promise. Their daughter was not just safe, she was free. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, brass key attached to a simple cork float. He pressed it into Olivia's hand. Then I think, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you should do the honors. A moment later, the gentle silence of the afternoon was broken by a new sound, the low, confident rumble of a finely tuned engine turning over, settling into a steady, powerful hum. It was the sound of a journey beginning.